What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Kilo Loco, and today we're going to be going over unit testing. Now, I'm going to actually dive into how to use a more realistic approach on getting started. So if you haven't started writing unit tests, then I'm going to essentially show you how to get started. And this isn't going to be like I'm going to show you how to increment a number in a test, which is totally unapplicable. Hopefully my example will be a little bit more real world so that you can actually start adding tests into your project starting today. All right, so the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this project, right? So I just want to break it down real quick. It's nothing too crazy. And as you can see over here, we actually have the app right here, very basic login, username field, password field, a login button. That's translated right here. We're using storyboards. That's fine, whatever. And then we have this dummy database. This is what we're going to pretend that we're going to use for our database just so that we can, check if we logged in or not. What I really want to focus on though is this part right here where we actually have some of this logic, right? So we're actually going through a process of validating if all of this information that's being passed in is actually good, right? We want to make sure that the username is going to meet some criteria, and the same thing with the password. If that all goes through fine, then what we're going to finally do is we're going to send that data over to our database, at which point we'll be able to log in. And if, for whatever reason, if we don't send the right credentials, then we'll get a login error. So the problem that a lot of people end up having is they don't know how to test stuff that's already inside of their view controllers because it's already tied inside of their view controllers. And I would say that yes, there are a lot of different ways that you can test a view controller. You could even choose a different architecture that will make things a little bit easier. But overall, what it really comes down to is if you're working with some type of logic, think to yourself, am I able to break some of this stuff out? And as we look right here, we're doing some type of logic where we're checking, is this a valid username? Is this a valid password? And if it is, then we can proceed. But if it's not, then we can essentially throw some type of error. And this type of code is actually the easiest to test. And this is what I recommend that you try to do in your very own projects is you look for code where you're passing something in and you're getting some type of result out. So whenever you see something that can go in and then it transforms, or there's some type of checking or logic that's run off that information that you put in, and then you get some type of output, that's going to be the easiest part to start testing. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually start refactoring some of this code into its very own service. So let's go ahead and create a new file for that now. All right, so as you can see, I created a new file called validation service. And what this is going to allow us to do is break out some of the validation code that we have back in our view controller and put it in here into separate functions. From there, what we'll do is we'll be able to actually test the validation logic in unit tests. And that's why we want to break it out, is one, to make sure that we have all of our code that's related to each other and doing a specific thing in one place, as well as make it very easy to test. So let's start adding some functions in here that will allow us to validate the username and validate the password. All right, so now that we have two functions, one called validate username and one called validate password, what we can do is we can copy that functionality that was back in our view controller and we can add it to each of these functions where it's relevant. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so as you can see, we refactored some of the logic so that each validate is only validating the thing that it's supposed to, right? So we have the username being validated right here, and we have the password being validated right here. And we're getting these errors because validation error is actually part of the view controller down here. So what we want to do is we'll just actually break this out into its own object, and it'll just be an enum, and we'll keep that in the same file as our validation service. All right, so now that we have validation error over here in our validation service file, and it's no longer a sub object of our view controller, now we can actually use it just like this. Very nice, very clean. very sexy. So what we need to do is we need to head back over to our view controller. We need to remove all of this code right here, and we need to replace it by using our validation service. In order to do that, we actually need a couple of initializers. So I'm going to throw in a few at the top. All right, so as you can see, now we have a property called validation, and that's just going to be our validation service. And then regardless of how you decide to use your initializers, whether it's going to be through programmatically creating this view controller, or if you're using storyboards, then we're just going to simply pass that validation object and initialize our view controller with that. So now we can go down here into our did tap login button functionality, and we can refactor the rest of this code to make it nice and sexy. All right, perfect. So as you can see, very nice, very clean, very tight and sexy. So what we want to do is we just want to make sure that all of this works. And I understand that we haven't actually gone into testing right now, but testing actually encourages better practices for breaking code out and making it more modular and reusable, and therefore even more testable. So let's go ahead and make sure that our validation logic works. And I'll actually have the validation service pulled up here in the background so that you can kind of see what's going on. If I have something too short or too long, we're going to get one of these errors. If it's too short or too long for the password, same thing. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. All right, perfect. So we went through all of our different use cases. We verified that all the logic is still working as we expect it to. And now we can actually start writing tests. So let's go ahead, go back over to our project. And what we need to do is we need to actually go to File, New, and we're going to actually do a new target. So click on Target, make sure that you scroll down and you scroll to the test section. What we're going to do is we're going to select Unit Testing Bundle. From there, hit next, and what you'll see is you're going to have the product name automatically be populated as whatever your project name is. In this case, mine is called Just Start Testing. So you see Just Start Testing, and then without a space, it's going to say tests. Just so that I can keep it a little bit more consistent, I'll add a space right there. It really doesn't matter. So from there, once you have your product name set the way that you want it to be, go ahead and hit finish. All right, so as you can see, what it did is it created our target down here. And if you do the drop down, you'll actually see that you get this new Swift file. Now we're actually not going to be using this specific one. It's all boilerplate. You could actually delete all of this and nothing would happen. We're going to just go ahead and create a test for our newly refactored code that is very easy for us to test. So let's go ahead and create a new file and call it validation service tests. When you're creating a new test file, make sure that you choose unit test case class. Now you don't have to do this. You can create it from scratch and that would be fine, but this gives you all the boilerplate just like any other Swift file would. Whenever you're going to save a new test file, make sure that you have the correct target selected, in which case it's going to be a unit test and it's going to have a little Lego block looking icon right there. Make sure that's selected and that you're saving the file in the correct spot. Now we have our validation service tests. And once again, all of this is boilerplate. We can just go ahead and remove it just like if it were a view controller file. From here, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I open up my validation service and I can see it while I'm writing my tests so that I can go back and forth, make sure that I'm getting all the use cases that I want to have covered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command, Shift, and O, and that's going to give me my open quickly. From here, I could type in validation service. As soon as it comes up, I can do Control, Shift, Enter, and that will actually allow me to choose where I want to put this screen. I'm going to hit the right arrow key and I'm going to put it to the right. And now I can see both my tests and my validation service over here at the same time. I can go ahead and close this pane by hitting Command 0, and that's going to close it. So now I can see both my tests and my validation service. The first thing that we need to do is get our validation service into our validation service test class so that we can reference it. So let's go ahead and add that now. Now, what you'll notice is that you're actually not going to get any syntax highlighting, and you won't actually be able to access anything from your actual project. And the reason for that is because we have to do an import on our actual app. So what we need to do is we need to do @testable and import our app. I'll do that now. And just keep in mind that when you do an import on your app, if you have spaces in your name, it'll actually show up as underscores just so that it is one long word. So make sure that you have @testable and import your app name. Now, as you can see, we get syntax highlighting and we have a validation service. But if I were to try to use this, it would actually crash because we don't have an instance, or we're not setting a value to this validation. So what we need to do is we need to add instance of this validation service whenever we're going to start a test. And the way that we do that is with a method called setup. So let's add that now. So setup is kind of like a view.did_load. You could kind of think of it like view.did_load. Every time you run an individual test, and each function that we're going to write below is going to be a test. Every time you run one of these tests, this function will run. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're going to have an instance of our validation service for each of these tests. So since our validation service is a struct and it just has a couple of functions in it, and we're not having any state on it or modifying it in any way, we don't really have to worry about if it's going to affect our other tests. But it is best practice to make sure that you tear down any state that you have in between each test so nothing leaks over in between tests. And what I mean is, if this had a value of like 1, if we were storing some type of value of like 1 or whatever inside of our validation service, and then we were to increment that during one of our tests, then move on to the second test, and we were expecting it to be 0, well, it would be 1 from the previous test. And that's why we need to implement the teardown method. So as you can see, I'm setting validation equal to nil. Now, if you run into this problem, it's probably because you used autocomplete, and what it's doing is it's actually using the class function, and that's not what we actually want. So remove the word class, and there's a different function called teardown on it, which is an instance method. So it will actually be able to access any properties that are stored in here. Lastly, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we keep any original functionality. Just like whenever you override anything else, like in your view controller or any other class, we want to keep that functionality. So make sure that you do super.setup, super.teardown. All right, finally, we're pretty much set up, and just to make sure that everything is working as expected so far, as you can see, there's this little diamond where the number 12 would be for this class. Let's go ahead and run that, and that's going to actually run our unit tests, any and all unit tests that are inside of our validation service tests. And as you saw, it did pass. So whenever you hit this and you see the little icon pop up, it'll let you know, did the test pass? Did they succeed? Did they fail? And what's going on? Since we don't have any tests, it should definitely pass, and it did. So let's go ahead and start adding in some tests. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to test validate username, this function right here. And what I like to do is I like to go the happy path first. I want to make sure that everything is working as expected, and then I go through each of the different types of errors that might be experienced in any of these test cases and go through each of those afterwards. So happy path first, and then I go through all the errors afterwards. So let's go ahead and add in a new test for validate username. So we have our first test, which is called test is valid username. And the first thing you're probably going to notice is that it's snake case. And we don't normally write snake case anywhere else in our code, but with tests, this is a normal convention. In some other languages, you might even see whole entire strings being used as the name. And what the general idea is that you actually write out kind of like a sentence of what you're trying to test to make it as clear as possible. So right now we're testing is valid username. We're just making sure that it's working as expected. So let's go ahead and test validate username, and we'll pass in the working path first. All right, so as we already know, validate username and passing in something like Kilo Loco, where the character count is greater than 3 and it's less than 20, meets all the criteria, and we should definitely get a valid username, right? So this would essentially work if we had it in our code, and we do have it in our code. So we wouldn't expect it to throw any errors because this is a throwing method, right? Since it throws. So the way that we would test this is we would actually wrap it in an XCTAssertNoThrow. All right, so as you can see, we wrapped it in XCTAssertNoThrow, and if we option click on this, you can actually see that this is a function that's expecting an expression. In this case, this is our expression, try validation.validate username Kilo Loco, and if it doesn't throw anything, then essentially the test will pass. If it does throw an error, then the test will not pass, and essentially this would be false. So whenever you have these XCTAssert statements or functions, you're going to pretty much be checking that whatever follows the assert word is true. So no throw, does it throw? If no, then that's true, and essentially our test will pass. So let's go ahead and run this test. And as you can see, we have the play button right here. It'll run this individual test, and we get the check mark right here, and it says our test passed. Now, if we were to change this to something that wouldn't meet the criteria, like KL, since this is going to be shorter than 3 characters, we should get an error, and it's going to throw that error. So then it will be throwing, therefore no throw is false, and that means that our test will fail. So as you can see, our test fails, and actually gives us a little message right here. It says username too short. That's the error that was thrown. So this is kind of the basis behind it. What we're going to do is we're going to essentially be using XCTAssert to determine whether something is true or not. And if it's true, then it passes. If it's false, then it fails. So let's go ahead and fix this again. All right, going to run. And it looks like everything's working as expected. And what I'll do is I'll actually close this out a little bit more just so that we can see it a little bit easier. All right, so the happy path works. So now what are some of the situations that can cause an error to be thrown? So if we go ahead and take a look at our code, the first thing that we're checking is to see if username is nil or not. Since we allow it to pass in an optional string, we're actually checking, does username have a value? And if not, then throw an invalid value error. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in nil. We're going to trigger this case, and we're going to verify that we do get this error. If we don't get this error, then we would have a problem, but we want to validate that we do actually get this error. So let's go ahead and create a new test that checks that. All right, so as you can see, what we did was we used XCTAssert, and now what are we asserting? We're asserting that it throws an error, right? So when we try to validate that a username is valid, but we pass in nil, then we should be getting an error. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure that this is also correct. But right now, Xcode's being kind of weird. It's not checking to make sure that this is a valid test. So you can fix this one of two ways. You could either go up to the top and you can hit play, and that will trigger the tests to run all again. So all of your tests will run, or you could do Command B, and that will build it. It will update Xcode, and it will verify and see that there is a new test to run, and we can just hit the play button right here. All right, so as you can see, we have another passing test, but this isn't that helpful because this error isn't actually being identified. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we're getting a very specific error, because if we were to pass a nil and we were to get an error that says username is too long, well, that's incorrect information that we would be passing to the user. So what we want to do is we want to actually check what error is being thrown, and then what we want to do is we want to validate and verify that that error is the error that we expect. So let's go ahead and explicitly say what error we're expecting, and let's go ahead and also hold a reference to the error that's being thrown. And we can do that by opening up a closure at the end of XCTAssertThrows_error. It will pass in the error that's actually thrown. We need to hang on to a reference of that, and then we can check the other stuff against it. All right, so as you can see, we used this closure, and I'll actually close this out right now. We actually used this closure to capture the error that was thrown. We pass it into the closure, and now this error that we have outside of this closure right here is going to be ready to receive that error. Now, this is just a generic error that's thrown in here. So what we need to do is we need to cast it as a validation error. This way we can compare the two later in our validation of assert equal, right? So as you can see, we have this expected error. We're expecting it to be a validation error and specifically invalid value error. So now when this error is thrown and we pass it into error, we should expect that the error that was thrown is the same as invalid value. And we're just doing that right here. Our expected error is equal to this error. And that's what XCTAssertEqual is saying. So let's go ahead and run this test and make sure it still passes. Perfect. So as you can see, it's very simple. We're just checking very basic things, and we're just going down the list of the different types of errors that we can have, because each of these is a different route that our code can go down, and we want to make sure that we cover all the different cases. Now, there's two more cases that we need to check. And if we open up our validation service one more time, we can see that we need to check for, or we need to run tests for the username being too long and the username being too short. So go ahead and pause the video right here, give it a shot, see if you can implement these yourself, and come back and see if your code is similar to mine. All right, so as you can see, I created these two different tests, and one is testing if the username is too short, the other is testing if username is too long. So let's go through these real quick. And as you can see, the expected error for this use case is going to be username too short. We're going to do the same thing. All I'm going to do instead of passing nil is I'm going to pass in a short username. And as we might remember, that if we open up our validation service, you can see that it needs to be greater than 3 characters. So if it's exactly 3 characters or less, then this test should fail, or this validation should fail, thus throwing this error, and it's going to be cast as a validation error. So then we have that error in here, and we're just going to make sure that these two, the expected error and our error, are actually equal. Let's run that, make sure that it works. Perfect, and we get succeeded. Now going down to if the username is too long, we did pretty much the same exact thing. We're just making sure that the username, or the expected error, is username too long. Now what I did differently here was I created another property called username, and I passed in the username since it was going to be a little bit longer, and I added this additional test. Now we're doing XCTAssert, and we're just saying, is it true or not? And as you can see, I'm saying username.count is equal to 20. So once again, if we were to open up our validation service, I want to make sure that it's greater than 20, or that our password is, or not our password, but our username is less than 20. And if it's equal to 20, then it's not less than 20, therefore causing us to have a too long username. So I'm just making sure that our username is 20, essentially the threshold that we need to hit in order to get this to throw the error. And then we do everything the same. Once again, validate this username. We get a thrown error, cast it as a validation error, hang on to that error up here, and then we check, is our expected error the same as the error that we actually got? We run that test, And as you can see, we get the assert true is passing. We get this assert throws an error is passing. XCT assert equals is passing. If we were to change any of these, like if this was 10, we should get an error right here saying that this test actually failed, and it would give me an error specifically right here. So that's pretty much all you have to do in order to write tests. And as you saw, we pretty much did it by refactoring some of our code and then making it much easier to test and actually making our view controller call site way cleaner, a lot less lines of code. So now that we actually have tests, what we can do is we can edit our schema. Go up to the top, go down to edit schema. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we're on the options tab of our test. And we're going to do gather coverage for all targets and go ahead and close that. And what that will do is it will actually allow you to know how much of your code base is covered. So when I actually run one of these tests or do Command U and I start running all my tests, what will happen is a report is going to be generated for us, and it's actually going to tell us how much of our code base is covered. So if you go all the way to the right of the navigator pane and go to reports, then what you can see is you can see this test, which was done right here. And you can actually see all the different tests are being logged in this pane as well. So if you go to the most recent test and then you go to coverage and you drop down, you'll actually see your app and all the code coverage that you actually have. Now, you'll get percentages over here, and I don't want you to strive for 100%. I think that it's actually probably impossible to get 100% code coverage. It would just make your code completely like unmodifiable. So you want to keep your code mutable. You want to be able to make changes, add things to your app. So don't strive for 100%, but you should strive for some type of number, maybe 50%, maybe higher than that, maybe a little bit lower if you're just starting out. Now, the thing that we were testing was our validation service. And for this specific file, if we double click on it, what you'll actually notice is it's showing you which areas are not actually being tested. When you're creating smaller services that do a very specific thing, it's perfectly fine to go for 100% coverage. I'm just talking about not the entire code base. But for something as simple as this, something that goes through and does a very specific thing, it should be very easy for you to go back and do 100% code coverage for smaller services like this. For example, as you can see, the error description is actually not being tested whatsoever. So we can add in some tests, or we can modify our current tests to cover these use cases. The same thing with validate password. So since we already have a couple of tests that are using our username too long, too short, and invalid value, what I can do is I can go back over to our tests and I can just add in a simple XCTAssert statement to hit each of those points, and then we would actually get more coverage on our code. So let's go ahead and add some of that in right now. All right, so as you can see, I added the same assert statement to each of my error cases. So test username is nil, right? So since we have invalid value and we're going to be having the expected error test the error description against the actual error that we get and check that error description, and this is actually wrong, and we're checking that against that error description, what you can see is we're actually going to be able to get more coverage on our code by having each of these error descriptions checked. So once again, if we go over to our coverage, before we run our test one more time and we take a look at our validation service, we have the entire block right here that's red. Let's go back, or we can actually just do Command U to run all of our tests. We get test succeeded, and it's actually showing that our blocks are now limited to just these two. These few things have not been tested by our code. Everything else has been tested, and there's no longer that red statement right there. So it's really easy to see what parts of your code base are not being covered and to see which parts are being covered. And if it's something like this, then you know I need to go back and add a couple of extra tests or modify my currently existing tests to cover these specific cases. So what I would recommend is go through with this project, download this project, and I want you to actually go through and add the test cases for your validate password. It's pretty much all the same, and the benefit to doing this is actually writing it and typing it out yourself and internalizing testing. So I really want you to just pause right here, download the project files. The link is in the description, and pick up from here, go back over to your test and add 3 more tests down here that will cover the same things. You want to check if your password is nil. You want to check if your password's too short, if it's too long. Go back and add those right now. All right, so that's pretty much it. I hope that you accepted the challenge to go over and do that work by yourself, write out those tests by yourself so that you can really start internalizing how to write tests and start adding them to your project. I mean, you don't want to be in the tutorial trap, right? Well, if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for viewing. I hope you learned something new. And if there are any more topics that you want me to cover, then let me know. Leave a comment down below. And if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And I'm going to be putting out all kinds of great content. So that's going to be it for today, everybody. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the day and go out there and make sure you keep coding passionately.